Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Hypatia and Augustine of Hippo. So Hypatia, the date she was born is somewhat disputed. The dates range from 350 AD to 370 AD. So just based on that spread, it's more likely she was born, we could use the mean, which would be 360 BC, which would be a messy way of doing it. But nonetheless, Augustine was born in 354 AD, so it is most likely that he was born before Hypatia, but nonetheless, I wanted to kind of clock in Hypatia at the earliest projected birth date, and also I think since she's the first female that we've covered thus far, it would be nice to put her first nonetheless. I might retroactively add some more females. Some that might come to mind, obviously, are like Cleopatra, but I would say she's not specifically a leader of thought, even though she was a political leader. She would have been probably a better fit in the ancient Greek and Roman history. However, she was not explicitly covered in Plutarch's Lives like that, so I did not, but I might do it at some point. So nonetheless, Hypatia was considered the first female mathematician, or confirmed female mathematician. Another one that comes to mind is, and I want to give a notable mention to Pedagogy, who found a way. It was called the Delian problem. So essentially they needed a way to, or some kind of formula to double the size of a cube, assuming you want to, for example, double the side length. So she found an approximation for doubling cubes and approximating cube roots. So a pretty important innovation in terms of mathematics, but there just simply wasn't enough recorded information for me to make a whole video on her. So nonetheless, Hypatia is what we could call the first confirmed female mathematician. She's also considered a martyr of philosophy because, as we will see, she had a pretty tragic death, and she's also considered the last of the Hellenes, which is essentially a categorization that they give to a lot of these thinkers based on where they're from. So nonetheless, those are three titles that she has. So she was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, who is a pretty famous mathematician at the time. He had what's called the Musion school, which was very exclusive and prestigious and conservative, so only really pretty selective, only certain individuals in Alexandria could attend. And it was said that, after he was dead and far beyond, he actually didn't have that much of an influence on the mathematical landscape at the time. He was more so just a compiler of information. He actually compiled a new version of Euclid's Elements, which actually became one of the most popular versions for over 100 years. So obviously, I've mentioned Euclid's Elements many times. It's pretty much the first most important mathematical textbook throughout history. So despite Theon not being particularly innovative necessarily, he had a huge influence just by creating modern examples of this. Just like you could say, for example, these YouTube videos, although I'm not actually creating any history here, I think it's an important function to sort of modernize this information and put it into video format. So that let's not completely discredit her father, Theon, at this point. She and her father they're pretty famous for opposing this individual called Iamblichus. So Iamblichus came after Plotinus, who I covered in the previous video, and he sort of had a newer version of Neoplatonism. So Hypatia and her father actually took a step back and they followed more so Plotinus in terms of their ideology. So if you want to get a little bit more about their former Neoplatonism, maybe check out my video on Plotinus. But nonetheless, so her career was mostly in association with rejecting the beliefs of Iamblichus. So eventually she ended up teaching at the Alexandrian school, and the School of Alexandria was the philosophical center, with the only exception maybe being Athens. So obviously a very important school for her to work at. And she was known for wearing a cloak and walking around and giving like a classic philosopher coat, like the stereotype philosopher coat of a philosopher. Anyway, she would give impromptu lectures and such. So just kind of a style, almost kind of stoic, you could think, in that sense. It's said by Philosopher that she surpassed her own father in mathematics, which is good because we've already got the criticism that Theon did not really create anything in that space. And it is also said another characteristic by Damascus, who eventually kind of turned her into martyr and really sort of took advantage of her legacy. He said that she was exceedingly beautiful and fair of form. So obviously this painting that we have here came much after. This is an actress playing the part of her, so there's no actual real depictions of her, but it said that she was quite beautiful. And I'm not just pointing this out because she's a female. I make sure to note this, whether it's a male or female. I think at least we've seen in many of the previous history leaders of thoughts, but also the political leaders we've seen, there also is a correlation between, at least a binary correlation between beauty and success. So I just wanted to point that out. It could not be true because we don't have any accurate pictures of her, but just I think it's important to mention. It's also said that she lived her life as a lifelong virgin. So at one point there was this individual, a young man, who was going to all of her lectures and trying to court her. And what she did was she showed him her menstrual rags and says, "This is what you really love, my young man, but you do not love beauty for its own sake." And yeah, basically scared him off. So they say that this menstrual rag was probably proof that she maintained a virgin throughout her whole life, but it could also be mentioned as the contrary. But I think sort of, as I sort of approach all these things, sort of assume the rumors are true, and let the cynics, we can call them, try to disprove them, and maybe we'll accept the disproving. But either way, that's how I prefer to follow her. So Theophilus, who was a bishop, so this ultimately, he took a very he was against Umbilicus, sort of very much like Hypatia and her father, but he was militarily against it. So whereas Hypatia was, she supported Plotinus's form of Neoplatonism, she would obviously never go to war and fight Umbilicus, but this individual did. So, but because he had such a harsh opposition against Umbilicus, he sort of allowed Hypatia to climb out the political ranks and gain Roman influence. But ultimately, his nephew, when he passes away, his name is Cyril, came into power, or started fighting over the role of bishop for the town. Cyril sort of opposed everything that Timothy, his rival, pushed. And Timothy, his rival, was into paganism and that sort. So Cyril made sure to get rid of any sort of non-Christian beliefs. And that was sort of characteristic. So Hypatia was actually a pagan. Her father was a pagan as well. But all of her students were actually Christians. So she was very tolerant in terms of beliefs, despite her pagan beliefs. But Cyril got rid of all the synagogues too, so anything that was non-Christian he got rid of. And eventually there was this individual named Orestes, who was a Roman prefect, who did not like all these things that Cyril was doing. He thought it was, obviously criminal, sort of attacking people based on their beliefs. So he along with Synesius, convince Hypatia to sort of get into the negotiations, trying to calm Cyril down. And he says, you can always have power, and you can bring about good by using that power. But ultimately, she's riding in a carriage, and this Lector Peter and a big group of pro-Christian mob, essentially capture her carriage and take her into this former pagan temple and stripped her of her clothes and killed her, and with what's called ostraca. So it was either with roof tiles, so maybe they beat her to death, or it could also be translated to oyster shells. So I think roof tiles is much more likely, but just want to cover the spectrum there. They ultimately separated her limbs and carried it through town and burned them. This is not completely uncommon. It was common for the vilest of criminals, but for Hypatia, who was sort of religiously tolerant, didn't really have anything against Christians. In fact, she taught most of her most famous students were Christians. It seemed like a very harsh action. So this was kind of used by Damascus and Orestes to sort of push the as a sort of attack against Christianity, and she was kind of treated as a martyr. And despite her actually advocating for tolerance, she kind of became a tool or a weapon to create a divide. So Orestes ultimately, the Romans try to push Cyril out and get Orestes in power, but ultimately Cyril wins over. So this could have had something to do with maybe the inevitability of Christianity taking over, Neoplatonism and older former religions such as paganism. But this obviously scared a lot of people throughout the whole Roman Empire, because usually intellectuals were pretty much, they had a sort of safety in that they, most people would not, cut people up who have different beliefs. And not only that, she was a woman, so this really unsettled the empire at the time. So in terms of her actual belief, she was considered a universal genius. However, most of what she did was through teaching and commentary. So no independent works on her philosophy exist to this date. That doesn't mean they did not exist, or she did not have too many of her own original ideas. But I think her importance of just, sort of like her father in terms of translating and carrying on this information is very important. So she created an edition of the Almagest by Ptolemy, and she incorporated a improved version of long division. So and she also ran using Ptolemy's heliocentric, which is Earth-centered model. She would run calculations on this. So obviously a student of Ptolemy, but also marginally pushing the boundaries and pushing beyond what Ptolemy knew. So obviously very important in that regards. She's famous for using some inventions. This is an astrolabe, which is essentially a tool for calculating where planets or stars might be, and it also could be used for predictions on any given day, the one she used. So she obviously did not invent the hyperlab, but she was very, very, I guess, industrious in terms of using it. He's also famous for using the Hydrascope here, which could be used for measuring relative densities of things using liquid and buoyancy. So obviously, and she would obviously like these things it was not like they had Amazon and could order these online. She obviously had to know the synchronicities and had to create it herself. So I guess you could also call her an inventor too. That's why she's considered a universal genius. So nonetheless, she, in terms of her legacy, so Damascius, who is a very famous philosopher, sort of used her as sort of a tool to sort of fight against kind of the last fight against Christianity before it ultimately took over. I didn't mention this, but also under Marcus Aurelius' leadership, that was when Marcus Aurelius did not openly oppose the Christians, but some of his subordinates sort of started pushing them out. So already this divide and rift was starting in Rome. But she established for a while a legacy of tolerance, and also the concept of building on other people's beliefs. So that's Hypatia. We'll obviously get to way more in this on the comparison, because I think there's a lot that can be directly contrasted, but also elaborated on through its direct comparison with Augustine. So Augustine of Hippo. So he was born in, he was considered Roman African. He was born in Numidia province. So it's said that he probably spoke Latin as his first voice. So they were a very Romanized group of Africans, but nonetheless, he probably, at least when he was in Rome, probably felt like somewhat of an outsider. And keep that in mind, just at the back of your head. At least he was a minority in that sense, so that probably might have had an influence on his beliefs. He was also a Neoplatonic philosopher, but he sort of shifts into becoming an early Christian philosopher. He's obviously had huge influence on Western philosophy, church, Christianity, and he's known for establishing anew the ancient faith. So it's possible that without Augustine, we might not even have Christianity today. He didn't receive his baptism until he was 32 years old at 386 AD, which is quite old, and we'll see how all that also carries into his character. And yeah, I suppose we'll just start off with his early life. So he was born in modern-day Algeria, which is a Roman province of Numidia. His father was pagan, but he was obviously not very close with his father, but his mother was a devout Christian. So he saw his father as sort of a stranger in his life, but his mother was like a central figure. So, as we'll see in the contrast with Hypatia, whereas Hypatia followed her father's footsteps almost completely, Augustine completely did not follow his father's footsteps, so that might have a certain implication on their ultimate beliefs and ultimate approach to them. He was probably an indigenous, like a Berber, so indigenous to the region. So obviously a little bit darker skin and that sort, but spoke primarily Latin, and they even spoke Latin at home as a sort of pride and dignity. So they were very proud to be Roman. Some proof that he was considered himself African. He has a few quotes. One to Apuleius, he says, the most notorious of us Africans, so referring to himself in the group of us as Africans. He refers to another Ponticanus as an African gentleman, and to Faustus, a Milive, a countryman of ours, insofar as being African. So obviously he considers himself part of the African community, but he also considers himself part of the Roman community. So this sort of duality has big influence on his life. He attended the school of Numidia, where he studied Latin and probably paganism, because Christianity really hadn't hit off until ultimately when he comes along. But when he was young, when he was 11 years old, he caught himself stealing with some of his friends. And here's his quote: He did not steal out of hunger, but because it was not permitted. It was foul, and he loved it. I love my own error, not for which I erred, but for the error itself. So he believed that this was proof of humans naturally, of original sin being within humans, and humans naturally have a predisposition to be evil, because he recognized that he wasn't even just committing this crime because he was hungry. He was committing it because he liked the crime itself, and that's why he thought that individual needs Christianity or Jesus Christ in their life. So that's where he sort of started formulating his ideas at 11 years old. At 17, he moves to Carthage to study rhetoric. It was obviously above the finances of his family, so they were pretty wealthy for Numidia, but obviously Numidia was a much poorer province in Rome. He was a bit of a hedonist during this period, so he would be boasting about his sexual exploits, and often they would make up stories and even lie about this amongst his friends. So I think this is a common theme we'll start to see. I think Augustine might have been almost a sex addict, because he almost goes completely to the other end of the spectrum and really tries avoiding this and thinking all sexual intercourse is sin, as we'll soon see. He read Cicero's dialogue, one of his dialogues, and Hortensius, and that's how his love for philosophy really began, and love for wisdom. And so obviously, once again, drawing back to the huge implications and legacy of Cicero, who I actually covered not in History of Leaders of Thought, but Ancient Greek and Roman History, because he was included in Plutarch's Lives. He had this lover that he had for 15 years, and he had a son with him not too long after the marriage, or it wasn't even a marriage because she was a concubine, a very poor woman. But it seems as though he was in love with her, but it was obviously not. He never got married because she was too poor for him and his mother didn't approve. But eventually he gets taken away from her, and he says, "My mistress being torn from my side as an impediment to my marriage, my heart, which clave to her, was racked and wounded and bleeding." So it obviously had a huge impact on him that he couldn't love who he wanted to love. Ultimately, he has to give this up because he gets engaged to this girl who's only 10 years old, and he has to wait 2 years because legally she has to be 12 to marry him. So obviously he's sort of being pushed into this relationship. But during this time, he actually vows to a life of celibacy as well. So one of the reasons why, as I sort of alluded to earlier, he was really into celibacy was that he was probably a sex addict in his own life, as I'll elaborate that on very, very soon. He never learned great Greek, and that was kind of a requirement to be any kind of philosopher or anything, because that's most the important and most significant texts up till that date were written in Greek. But nonetheless, he he learned to kind of speak it in a rough form. Supposedly he never learned to speak it properly or write it properly. It was because he had an abusive teacher. So I guess just kind of the direct influence there would be the significance of a teacher on one's life. So he taught grammar in Thagaste, which is in the province of Numidia, between the ages of 19 to 20. And then he ultimately moved to Carthage, and he taught rhetoric for 9 years in Carthage. So he was 29 by the time he went to Rome. And he went to Rome because he did not like the students in Carthage. He thought they were unruly, and he wanted to have some higher class students. But he did not really seem to find that exactly the case in Rome. But nonetheless, at 30, he meets this prefect of Rome, and he gets sent off to Milan to become a professor. And Milan was kind of becoming the forefront of thought at the time, so it also gave him a lot of political power. So as we saw kind of with Hypatia, they kind of managed to achieve political power through their academic career, whether they were pursuing it or not. But it was kind of, at least more, maybe even more so than today, they were kind of hand in hand, the academic community and the politically influential. It's said most of his friends were Manichaean. He was never initiated or elected, they call it, into the group, but it probably had a pretty big influence on him. He was considered an auditor of this a sect, which is like the lowest sect of Manichaean. Photos of Milive said that he studied skepticism at the new academy, so he studied Neoplatonism and skepticism, which are obviously just kind of further evidencing the fact that he was he explored everything before deciding on what he wanted to do. And that's what I think is also parallel to Hypatia, in that they were both tolerant to many different beliefs. So he tried paganism, he tried Manichaeanism, he tried skepticism, he tried Neoplatonism, but he ultimately chose Christianity. So, and this was because an individual named Ambrose in Milan sort of became his teacher. He said, "I began to love him, of course, not at first as a teacher of truth, for I had entirely despaired of finding that in thy church, but as a friend, as a friendly man." So this individual, so he did not, when he went to Milan, he just wanted to sort of be a normal teacher, continue teaching rhetoric or whatever it is he was doing at the time. It was rhetoric, actually. But he finds his bishop, and he did not want to sort of be converted to Christianity, but he did. Ultimately, the story as it goes is he heard this voice in his head say, "Take up and read," and he just opened up the Bible to a random page, and it said, "Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision of the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof." So he read that, and then he ultimately got baptized at the age of 32, which is quite old, especially considering those times. He also said of his teacher Ambrose, "That man of God received me as a father would, and welcomed my coming as a god," or a good bishop. So he really admired this individual. So once again, one teacher completely set him off from learning Greek, but another put him on and kind of set him on his path for life. So, and that was written in his book called Confessions. Ultimately, actually, Ambrose adopts him as a spiritual son after his own father dies. So once again, elaborating on their closeness. Yeah. So, yeah, in this time, he started marrying another concubine, because he wasn't allowed to be with his previous one, who got torn from his heart, as he described, and he had to wait for a new wife. But then he decides that he's going to give up all sexual pleasure, because I think he realized he was some kind of sex addict. And he said of this, actually, my favorite quote of the whole thing was, after he gives up the first concubine, he says, "Grant me chastity and confidence, but not yet." So this is his most famous prayer. And I think it's the most nice, whether you believe in God or you believe in any sort of religion or believe in anything, it's not a requirement today, and it's proof that even this guy, who's considered one of the most influential and most respected people in almost every single sect of Christianity, he was one who was willing to sin. That's what it basically means. He says, grant me chastity and confidence, but not yet. He's going to do things now and pay for it later, and that's part of his humility. He didn't think he was absolutely perfect. So he heard this childlike voice. He was baptized by Ambrose. And ultimately, after this, he returns to Africa with his son, who he had with the first concubine, and his mother. But his mother actually died in preparation to get there. So he gets there, and actually while there as well, his son died too. So he ends up donating a lot of his estate to the church. And ultimately, he actually becomes bishop of the region of Hippo, so back in his hometown. So very nice achievement for him to return to, but also kind of thanking him for his influence and pushing for the Christian religion that he accomplished in Milan. So ultimately, in terms of his death, the Vandals, who were a Germanic tribe who followed Arianism, which basically was a type, I guess you could call it a sect of Christianity, where they thought that Jesus was distinct and subordinate from God, but nonetheless a God himself. So it's just a little different sect, but nonetheless they invade Roman Africa, and they laid siege on his town. Supposedly Augustine performed a miracle in saving someone's life who got maybe hurt during the siege. Perhaps take what you will. I doubt it was too much of a miracle. It was probably just the practice of like a normal doctor's work, but either way, he was once again another thing. As once someone gets famous and stuff, more and more stuff gets attributed to them. But nonetheless, he ultimately died in this fighting, and they burned down the whole city though, but they preserved his cathedral and library, and he was canonized, and by Pope Boniface VIII, he gets called a doctor of the church. So he ultimately died doing something that he loved, but also he was not overly punished for it. They did not destroy his whole legacy. And so I guess we'll go into his philosophy. Or I guess we'll divide it into three groups: theology, philosophy, and sociology. So starting with theology, which is probably the biggest section. In terms of anthropology, he was one of the first to have a real clear vision as to what the human was. So he thought there was two completely different parts of the human. There's the soul and the body, as you probably heard kind of in different forms throughout your life. So your body, and they thought that there's this quote, "Caro tua conianx tua," which is your body is your wife. So they have to be in tandem, connected together. So the soul rules the body, and it had it's made of, and it's not restricted by dimensions, but the body is three-dimensional, but comprised of the four elements that we've seen. The fall of humanity caused there to be a combat between the body and the soul. So that's why, for example, his example that he always keeps alluding to is sexual desires is separate from the soul. It's a necessity, he says, for the human race to reproduce, but it is the physical body overcoming the soul. So sort of where Plato and Descartes, tried to combine the soul and the body into some kind of metaphysical union, he just kind of made the process, and this was hundreds and hundreds of years before Descartes, but after Plato. But he pretty simplified it. Just they're two separate things. There's a soul and the body, and they'll fight each other. He thought that there, in terms of his discussion on abortion, so this one we're still discussing it today, but he thought that abortion was always evil. But he was one of the first to actually mention that, there's a difference between an early and a late abortion. And he did believe that some period during the development of the fetus, the soul gets in the body. He has the quote, "The timing of the infusion of the soul was a mystery known to God alone." So he uses that as the example that, no one can ever be sure that they're not killing a soul. So he uses that as a kind of logical proof that it's always unethical. But sometimes it might be necessary, and maybe maybe sometimes it can be justified, is I guess what he was one of the earliest to allude to. And this was, well before, Christianity really hit its full speed. So quite a bit of forethought. In terms of creation, he thought the literal interpretation of Genesis was a little bit, should not be taken as such. He did not believe the world was created in 6 days. He thought it was kind of a metaphor or a logical framework. He references Sirach 18:1, where he says he created all things at once. So he thought that the creation was kind of a heuristic, kind of a metaphor for how things must be created, but no ways how it actually happened. And this is kind of matches up with kind of our current understanding of the universe, where we have the Big Bang. Everything was, as we believe, created all at once. And he thought that Adam and Eve were always mortal, even before they fell or were cast out of paradise. So just another point, take what you will of that. In terms of the original sin, so if you're familiar with Genesis 1, where, original sin was Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit and then they get consciousness, but then they also get sent out of paradise and are forced to work and that sort. So he thought that there were two cases. He thought it was either they were so foolish that they fell into pride, or they were had so much pride that they fell into foolishness. I think it's kind of I don't know, maybe I'm overlooking it, but I think it was kind of both simultaneously. If foolishness and pride one does not have to come before the other, one follow the other, they can come simultaneously, kind of like the creation of the world. So I don't know why he neglected that one. But Satan essentially sowed in the root of evil into one's sentences, and let's see. Yeah, essentially he thought that this connects most directly to his philosophical belief of free will. So at first, when he was younger, he thought that, as most thinkers of Christianity did believe, that there was a free will, and that was different from what the Stoics and a lot of the Cynics and a lot of other thinkers were kind of thinking of at the time. Even though Stoicism does advocate for free will, it wasn't necessarily free will as we know today. But what he believed was that free will always exists, never exists. Free will only exists in the light of sin. So sin is when, at first he thought, you sin because maybe you're hungry, right? You're hungry, so you steal food. But as he proved when he was 11 years old that some people do evil just for the sake of evil, he thought that the choice between sin and non-sin was the free will portion, whereas goodness was just given by God, and that was not, in no ways, a sense of free will. In terms of sacrament, so still on the topic of theology, he thought that he divided, religious practice into regular and irregular. But one thing that he thought that was different from most other thinkers at the time was that it does not really matter who performs the ceremony. Like, it doesn't need to be a respected priest as long as it's done properly and with the right intentions. I guess you would call it mens rea in legal terms. But he thought, for example, a baptism outside the church is not a sin, but it is not validated until they get a baptism from the church, but then it is retroactively applicable. So I guess it was just kind of more open beliefs to sort of, I think it was useful in allowing more people to join the religion, and I think that's what part of it had to do with inclusiveness, because especially his upbringing or his background as sort of an outsider. In terms of philosophy, so epistemology, which is essentially just the study of knowledge and knowing, he thought that, everything was influenced by this divine illumination. So, you perceive the world as God tells you how to see it. So he thought that was a very important of epistemology, which sort of differed from some of his earlier contemporaries. Just war is a very famous term that we have today. It essentially says that, war is just in that, for example, it creates economy, it creates jobs, it creates things to do. it creates competition, which creates innovation and that sort of thing. So he was one of the first to coin, he was the first to coin this term in his book, The City of God, and he said that for if one puts another group into a situation where their only defense is violence, the sin is on them, not the other person. And he thought that for peace, fighting must be possible in order to preserve it, but it should only be done in a defensive measure. So he was one of the first to say that, war is not altogether evil and has its benefits. So very, very early influencer on this. And this was later picked up by Thomas Aquinas and obviously many other philosophers in the future. As mentioned, free will, he thought, firstly, it applied to all humans and angels, but also obviously his concept of free will gets very essentially pigeonholed. Free will only applies to the evil, not to the good. Anything that you do good is not by free will, it is by what you were given and told to do. When you commit sin, that was your free will. So just sort of a different perspective of that. And lastly, in terms of predestination, sort of back on the topic of theology, he thought that it's called double predestination, possibly would it be. So predestination would be like one is chosen to go to heaven, so they're going to go to heaven, but double predestination is like one is chosen to go to heaven, one is chosen to go to hell. So, but this is kind of contrasted when he says, and what is written that he wills all men be saved, while yet all men are not saved, may be understood in many ways, some of which I have mentioned in other writings of mine, but here I will say one thing. He wills all men to be saved, is so said that all predestined may be understood by it, because every kind of man is among them. So basically, in this he says that everyone is predestined to go or for something, but it's hard. Some people say that it implies that some are predestined for hell as well. Hard to say. I think going back to his free will concept, I think it is that everyone is predestined, but they have the free will to maybe push them aside. I think that would be a nice way of comparing or combining these two beliefs. In terms of sociology, in terms of slavery, he was vehemently against slavery. He caused many of his clergy to release slaves. He wrote to the emperor to get rid of slaves. At the point they had this policy, and he thought that, especially he believed in getting rid of slavery for children, but Rome had the policy of having adoption, which was kind of like a form of slavery because they thought it saved children from infanticide, right? If the person really did not want the kid, they'll kill the kid if someone else doesn't take it. But nonetheless, Augustine ignored this and he sort of pushed for slavery. He said the condition of slavery is the result of sin. And yeah, in terms of Jews, so he thought that it was wrong for there is not one special group chosen by God. All people are, and that's why he thought it was inevitable that the Jews would get divided and spread across the world to sort of prove this point. He thought it was inevitable that all Jews would eventually, at the end of time, become Christian. So they're not special people, but he was not obviously an anti-Semite. He was just probably pro-Christianity. So in terms of sexuality, he thought obviously it's necessary, but he thought obviously only maybe just in marriage, but he advocated for avoiding marriage. And a lot of people think this is just a backlash because he was sort of a sex addict. He spent a lot of time with prostitutions, boasting about that. So maybe he saw it as one of the most evil sins because he suffered it and addicted to it. Just like someone who suffers from alcoholism might see alcohol as their bane of their existence, whereas someone who doesn't battle with alcoholism might be like, oh, it's like just caused a bad hangover. It's not that big of a deal. And in terms of pedagogy, which is just the concept of teaching, he thought that he came up with the mixed style and grand style, which I guess we've seen parallels before, should you just mix teachings, but also one of the things he included in pedagogy was the kind of incorporation of religious style and beautification of concepts. He thought that individuals could be taught in divided into three groups. There's the well-educated, those with no education, and those who think they have a good education, and they all deserve different ways of teaching. So, yeah, that is Augustine in terms of their comparison. So I think they both thought and lived different from their contemporaries. So Hypatia, well, actually, I guess we'll start from the very beginning. In terms of their fathers, Augustine sort of went the opposite direction of his father. His father was pagan. He chose to become Christian, whereas Hypatia chose to follow her father. Does that mean that Hypatia had less guts, I guess you could call it? I don't think so, because I think she was not necessarily just following her father. She just kept a more open stance. She never really picked. She never really said that her father was wrong or right. She just kind of learned everything. Most of her students were Christians, whereas Augustine sort of just picked Christianity and said, his father was wrong and his mother was right. So a little bit more broad. In terms of direct comparison, Christianity, Hypatia she didn't oppose it, but she enabled it, whereas Augustine outwardly pushed it. In terms of their death, Hypatia's was undoubtedly wrong and cruel. She was not even against Christianity, but it ultimately led to her martyrdom, whereas Augustine's death was actually pretty good. He died, defending his own hometown, his own home state, and he also was respected by the enemy, so quite different in that regards. But nonetheless, that's Hypatia and Augustine. If you have any other points in the comparison, you can always feel free to let me know. I appreciate that. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch some of the ones I make in the future, and some of the ones I've made in the past. Thanks so much.